Welcome to our podcast series, Identity Dialogue, Dialoguing with the Other and Myself. My name is Dr. Nita.chaudhuri, and I'd want to welcome Winnie Payne and Manisha Blaskovich. Today, we're going to talk about identity and gender and sexuality. Welcome, Manisha and Winnie.
Thank you for
Hi,
having
thanks
us.
for having me.
Hi. So I have a few questions, and we're just going to have a conversation a little bit about your journey and discovering your gender and orientation, and a little bit more about the generalities of definitions and that type of thing. I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your journey, Winnie, yeah, please.
Yeah. So my journey started when I was in elementary school. That's when I first started being like, I'm not sure if I like boys, if I like girls, if I like both, or people in between. So I came out a couple times when I was younger to my dad. I bet that was a little confusing for him, but he took it really well. In high school, I started looking more into my gender. I noticed I was quite uncomfortable wearing feminine presenting clothing and having long hair and things like that. So I shaved my head in grade 12. I started wearing more clothes that were comfortable for me. I started looking into gender things, more like transitioning things, which I didn't get into because I realized I wasn't trans, I was non binary. But there's not a lot of information out there when I was younger, especially. So it was a long journey, but I'm here now, and I identify as pansexual and non-binary.
Okay. So actually, it's interesting, those definitions of what they are, and we'll get back to that to understand what that means for the listener. I mean, Manisha, maybe you could give us a little bit about your journey, what you'd like to share with us.
Of course. So similar to Winnie, my journey started when I was probably in elementary school. I remember having crushes on girls, on boys, just on kind of anybody. But I didn't know what that meant, as a lot of young people do. There wasn't a lot of information. So growing up, I kind of always thought I was different than a lot of my friends in the way that I would express my crushes and even a little bit about my gender. But once again, growing up, there's not a lot of discussion regarding gender. So it wasn't until later, I would say probably in my second year university, that I really started to question, like, what does gender mean to me, and what is gender just in general. So I think once I opened up that door, it really allowed me to grow in so many different ways. I figured out that I don't really care about gender. I don't really care about the labels that I hold for my sexuality, something that I struggled with a lot in elementary school and high school and the beginning of university. Um, and then I came to a place only within the past couple of years that I really think I thrive in the absence of gender, and I thrive in the absence of labels. So I think, for simplicity, I would say I identify as queer. Like, if I were to hold a label, I would say that I'm queer in my sexuality and queer in my gender. And I think it's pretty, in my brain, it's pretty simple.
That's interesting. So it actually brings me to this question about definitions, because there's all these words that you threw out that are actually new for our generation to try and figure out, what do these mean? You talked about pansexual, you talked about queer, you talked about non-binary. All of these definitions seem to be important for you to understand yourself. And although you talk about not having labels, there's still these vocabulary that's help you position yourself in some way. And I'm wondering what role, and if you could give us some clarity around these definitions and how these labels have been useful. And maybe you can tell me what they mean, and also for the listeners.
Definitely. Sorry. So I think for me, obviously it's very dependent person to person. Everybody kind of, I think, approaches gender and labels in a unique way. I know that the term queer has been kind of redefined. Sorry. It has been redefined by the queer community, and people are taking it back because it used to be used as a derogatory term. And I think really owning the word queer as an umbrella term for anybody that doesn't follow heteronormative or cis ideals when it comes to how they present themselves can, to me, fall under the label of queer. So that's kind of how I look at it. And yeah, I think it just, for me, is something that I make it, so queer to me might be queer different from what queer to Winnie is.
Oh,
But
yeah,
yeah.
that's interesting. So, what do you think, Winnie? What does queer mean to you, and what is the definition for you?
I do agree with Manisha, where queer is almost like an umbrella term for anybody in the community to use, whether that's gender or sexuality. For me, I also say I'm queer a lot of the time because I don't like to explain what pansexual is to people. I think that one really confuses a lot of people, especially outside of the community. But queer, I agree, used to be quite a derogatory term for anybody in the community. And we've taken it back in the past, I'd say, decade or so.
Definitely.
Yeah, yeah.
So, you think it's only been 10 years? It's only been a decade that the queer term has been kind of reclaimed.
I would say 10 to 20 years, like early 2000s, is when it started to have that shift in the community. And where we kind of were like, yeah, I'm queer. So what?
And so, the term queer, does that mean, like, I think, and I'm asking this out of pure curiosity, does that mean that as a somebody who's been defined as a female at birth doesn't want a male partner, or does it mean that you could have a male partner and a female partner or a trans partner, or what does it mean to be queer as opposed to somebody like me who doesn't say I'm queer, I just say I like to be with men, sort of thing? Like, what does that mean? And what does that mean for you as an individual to be queer?
I would say
Manisha
for me,
or
oh,
Winnie? Yeah, go ahead,
okay,
Winnie.
okay. For me personally, queer just means I love who I love. My gender is fluid. Um, that's that's me being queer. But again, with different queer people like Manisha, that could be totally different. And like different people in my friend group say they're queer, but they're a lesbian, or they're queer and bisexual. So it's like a very big umbrella term for pretty much anybody to use, but
Mhm.
it definitely changes for person to person.
Okay. What about you, Manisha?
Yeah, I agree with Winnie with those points. And I also think that queer in itself can be a label, but I also think queer and being queer is kind of like a lifestyle. There's something called queer theory, which like examines the way that power works to kind of like institutionalize and perpetuate certain expressions of like sexuality and gender while stigmatizing others, right? So I think that being queer, being a queer individual, your existence itself is going against the norms of society. So I think a lot of times you can also hear the term people are like queering academia, they're queering like sports, they're queering any kind of institution that is in place that has like fundamental like colonial and heteronormative values ingrained in it. So I think to me too, being a queer person is challenging those ideas within any institution and bringing in like queer theory, like looking at it, being like, how can we deconstruct these notions of heteronormativity, let's say, like in academia or in sports? I think that's also a big thing. So I think for me too, queer is going beyond just my gender and just my sexuality, where, yeah, like my gender and sexuality are queer because I don't fall into the heteronormative ideals of relationships. But I also think I approach institutions differently than I would say somebody who isn't queer does.
And give me an example of how you approach them differently.
So personally for me, I'm doing my master's in epidemiology, researching the impacts of intersectionality of immigrant youth and their risk for depressive symptoms. So I think bringing my identity and my like positionality into that has been really important because as a queer person, I have been affected by healthcare differently. I've been affected by like education differently. So really bringing in a perspective of we want to make all identities inclusive within this research is like really important, and that goes beyond just including them into our sample or including it into the methodology. It's bringing in like queer theory, like critical race theory. It's bringing in feminist theory to really look at like the disparities that exist between all youth, not even just queer youth. I think it's like it doesn't have like my research doesn't have to focus on queer youth to bring queer theory into it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I understand. So you're including people who self-identify as not necessarily male or female, and who self-identify, who might have sexual practices that are different than the mainstream. So you're including everybody in the sample size in your work. And because you're queer, you can identify those people in the sample. Is that what you're saying?
A little bit. So I think it goes beyond that. I think it's yeah, so we do want to incorporate all identities into the samples, but then when you are getting your results and you're drawing conclusions, when you bring in theories that aren't like intersectionality theory that looks at how each part of everybody's identity influences their lived experiences and experiences of discrimination, of oppression. So I think especially in epidemiology, I think it's quite rare, not rare, but it's not as common to bring in theory like that when you're analyzing data. So I think being a queer person, I really want to place an emphasis on the fact that health is ever changing and is very dependent on people's identity. And a lot of queer youth don't have representation in research and in data that's being published. So bringing, even just by like, even if my research isn't actually like it's not, the focus isn't queer youth, but even bringing in those theories to analyze the data and those frameworks starts a conversation. And I think that's an important part about being queer is being when you are in places of like privilege and power, it's to you want to be able to use all of these resources that you have gained through being queer to increase representation for queer youth, queer adults, anybody really.
How about you, Winnie?
I definitely agree. It's almost like breaking the binary standard of consistently having two opposing things, whether that be male or female, or men or women. And especially in the healthcare system, it's really almost sad sometimes to see how we don't get taken care of if like with the same seriousness as a straight man, for instance. And it's really hard to find doctors who are accepting and want to help and also listen to you, listen to what you need instead of putting words into your mouth on what they think you need or what they think might help you, but you're in your own body and this doctor is not you. I definitely agree with that for sure.
So it's actually interesting. I have like a couple of questions and ideas. One of the thing is community, which you bring up, the queer community, this community, and community seems to be quite important for you. I wondered how community has helped you understand yourself. Like, what role has community played, and how important is it for these communities to be supported? I don't know if anybody wants to answer.
Yeah, I can go.
Yep.
Yeah.
I would say finding my space in the queer community with my queer friends specifically has really given me confidence just to be me and to dress how the way I want to dress, have my hair the way I want it, have the pronouns and have them respected. I think it's a very huge part of my confidence and my growth as a queer person. I've noticed when I was in elementary school, high school, I had very straight, cis women friends who were all into boys and partying and wearing very tight clothing. And I would go along with that and try and mask myself and be that feminine presenting person that everybody wants me to be. And when I finally decided that's not me, it my confidence really like skyrocketed. Like I don't care if people think I'm weird because I wear a lot of boy clothing or I have short hair or my pronouns are they them and they don't want to go by that. That's totally fine. Like I'm not here to educate people all the time, especially strangers who are just I meet at a party and they don't understand my pronouns. It's like that's fine. That's your life. I'm just letting you know mine. And if you respect that, that's cool. If not, see ya. You know, it's like that confidence really, really grows when you have the right community around you.
That's interesting. What about you, Manisha?
Yeah, I what Winnie said really resonates with me. I'm really happy that you have those friends that make you feel that way. I think that's really important and really special. Yeah, I think having a queer community, like Winnie said, you create this like sense of belonging, and you can you can talk to people who might have gone through similar things that you have and who approach. Oh,
Are you there? I think you just cut out. It's okay. I'll edit that.
what did okay, I'll say I'll go from yeah, um I think yeah, being having a queer community, it really increases your sense of belonging, and you can see yourself in your friends, which I think is like kind of cool. And I know that you should be able to do that. And I think for me, before I had my queer community and my queer friends, I don't think I could see myself in my friends. And that doesn't go to say that like I don't have straight cis friends. I do. But they understand, they don't no, I wouldn't say they understand, but they empathize and they're really open to learning about like queer culture and like our experience, which I think is really nice. And I think having a queer community too, it it helps you be more confident in yourself, and it challenges like those stereotypes that people have about what it means to like be queer or be part of the LGBTQ plus community, because like if you look at everybody's queer, like every individual's queer community, it probably looks really different, and I think that's really beautiful. Yeah,
So it's diverse. Actually, the queer community is diverse as any community is diverse.
exactly.
Yeah, that's really great. So it's important, I think, to live with this notion of gender of yourself. Do you feel like this notion of gender, you come to it by interacting and talking to other people in your community and you get a better understanding? Like something interesting is that, Manisha, you said you like living in the absence of the notion of gender. And Winnie, you said you like the notion of non binary, which is also, I guess, the absence of gender as well, right?
It can be, yeah.
Um, what I find interesting is I talked to somebody like a cis male who's in his 60s who said, why are these people so offended? Like, people are starving in the world. Why are they so offended? I personally got quite angry at this person. And then I thought, well, it's not me to answer. It's people like who are in the queer community where gender non-conforming gender is important, why is it important for the 6-year-old cis hetero white male to understand why it's important, these gender pronouns and this absence of gender? I mean, do you think you could answer that question?
For me personally, I think it's just simple as human respect. You got to respect everybody. And I truly think it's as simple as that for me.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you where it's like it's just respect. And like if I called a cis man a woman, he would have a hissy fit. Let's not lie here. Most of the time they would be offended. So
Yeah.
like why don't you think I would be offended if you misgendered me and continued to misgender me after I have told you that is not my pronouns? It's like respect.
So
Yeah.
what do you think? Go ahead, Manisha. What were you going to say?
Oh, and I think the lack of respect too from individuals is also very dangerous. If people don't start to change the way they perceive gender, it can be so dangerous, especially for like queer youth growing up. I think not having your identity validated from a young age can lead to negative like mental health outcomes, which is not fair in a way, you know?
I
So it's interesting. It comes down to respect and also safeguarding the mental health and well-being of people who, you know, their gender questioning is not in the norm. Um, so I actually had another question, which has slipped my mind, so I'm going to come back to it. But how does the history of queer culture help you situate, understand yourself and others? I think you talked a little bit about the history of queer culture. Where does that fit for you to understand where we've come in understanding that in society? I think Manisha, you talked a little bit about that.
Yeah. Um, the history of queer culture, I think, is it's quite complex and long, and I'm not an expert on it at all. I definitely could learn more and probably should and hopefully will. But I think my understanding of it right now has kind of similar to what my queer community does for me. It helps you overcome, I guess for me, is feeling not of I guess of isolation. I feel like a lot of queer, well, I can't generalize, but in my community, a lot of queer people I know have felt isolated at times, but learning about the experience of LGBTQ2S plus individuals like throughout history can help you develop kind of a sense of solidarity towards those individuals who went through what like probably 1,000 times worse experiences than what I've been through. And it can help you find strength in yourself to overcome challenges that you're facing in your everyday life, I think. And I think too, a big thing for me is like queer history really intersects with a lot of like social political movements like civil rights, feminism, all of that. And I think understanding these intersections can really help you be more, or it can help me be more aware of the world I'm living in and why the structures of power are the way they are right now, which sometimes makes me not feel too good because you look at it and I don't feel that hopeful that like they can change. But then it gives you a sense of pride and power because people over the course of queer history have been fighting against these systems of power that oppress them, and it makes you want to keep fighting for like equal rights and for equity within the queer community and just within the world in general. So I think for me those are the main I guess, takeaways I have from learning about queer history.
So there's some solidarity with other movements as well, in addition to the queer movement.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
How about you, Winnie? How has the history of queer culture helped you situate yourself?
It's been a journey. There's a lot of queer history that people don't really talk about. The main queer history people talk about is the Stonewall riots in New York in the 60s, where Marsha P. Johnson, who is a trans Black woman, basically fought back against the police and was like, "We belong here. I know you hate us, but you're not going to get rid of us. And you try and kill us off or put us in jail. Like it's not working. We're still going to be around." And that just learning that as a kid, I was like, wow, that that could be me. I'm POC. I'm non-binary. I could possibly make a difference in this world. And I know it's hard, and it was very hard back in the 60s. I can't even imagine what that would be like to go through going through raids and things like that, but it really opened my eyes to wanting to do more and do better for the community and help everybody as much as possible. Obviously, like, there's a lot of us and I can't help every single one of us, but just having that knowledge in my brain of Marsha P. Johnson just really, I don't know, really pushes me to
Empowers
do
you?
better.
It
Yeah, yeah,
empowers you. You feel inspired and empowered,
yeah,
and
yeah.
also a role model as well.
Yeah, sometimes especially for I'd say younger queer youth, I almost have like this sense where I want to do the best I can for you and be the best example for you and show you that over time things will get better. And it's always hard. It's always hard being any kind of minority, but as long as you work hard and have your like sense of worth with you, I think it will eventually work out.
Wow. So, one of the things you talked about was the role of language, which is rooted in gender. And it's important to understand that. I think that's super important when you think about how we use language: they, them, she, her, he, his. I know for me personally, my generation is still getting their tongue around they and them and actually trying to, you know, get used to using those pronouns, to in your head try and understand this they them, like actually conceptually understand that. It's quite difficult. I need to be very honest about it. It's quite difficult to understand that and to really embrace it in a way that we understand it, because up until now we've seen the world as a binary. So, so I wondered if you might talk a little bit about language and how important it is. I know, Manisha, you mentioned a little bit about this, and then maybe Winnie could give us some.
Yeah. Yeah, language, I think it's so complex, and I think a lot of languages, not only the English language, is like really rooted in gender and has kind of created like gender norms within language itself. And sometimes like you draw connections between certain words and certain genders, right? Like if we think about like stereotypically, if you think about like somebody who's athletic, a lot of people will immediately think of a man, right? You'll think of a strong man who's athletic, but that's not necessarily true. There's a lot of strong athletic women and non-binary individuals and trans individuals. And I think when you start to deconstruct the perceptions you have about certain words, about certain phrases, about descriptors that we use for the binary, once you start to go past that, you can realize that like words are just words to a degree, and they can apply to so many different kinds of individuals. And when you start lending language to the binary system, it erases so many different individuals who don't fall within that binary. And it can lead to a bunch of unconscious like bias about the way people perceive and treat other individuals who might not fall within the binary. So I think it's like super important to like I still do this. I have a lot of biases when it comes to how I perceive individuals and how I speak, but I think it's really important to be aware of that and to actively ask yourself, how can I be better? Or is there better like language that I can use for these individuals? Or if this individual tells me that they're non-binary, how can I change the way I'm speaking to not, I guess, perpetuate the binary system? Because language, like, I think does have a lot of power, and it can create power imbalances too between different genders. And I think there's a lot to say. I'm not obviously an expert in this either, but those are kind of just like my initial thoughts. I don't know, maybe Winnie
Winnie,
has
you have something you like to say about that?
Yeah. I I have noticed a lot of the older generation has a hard time specifically with they them pronouns. And I find it funny sometimes because in a lot of different languages that aren't English, they don't have pronouns. So I'm
Mm-hmm.
like, I don't know why this language works, but English just has to really go and be extra. But yeah, just like even with my mom, she's from the Philippines. There is so many dialects in the Philippines, but specifically Tagalog doesn't have pronouns specific anything. And I've noticed like when she speaks English, she has a hard time gendering people, not just because how they look or they present. It's just because in Filipino they don't have that. So it's hard for her in English to kind of wrap her head around the binary, which is funny because they them pronouns is also hard for her. I think maybe because it is a different word and the way they say specific things in the Filipino language opposed to English is different. But it's sometimes I find it funny when I'm like, a lot of other languages don't have that binary, but English just does, which sucks.
Well, it's actually
Yeah.
interesting because the other day a woman came to visit us from Sweden, and she met a Canadian woman who said, "Oh, you can be prosecuted if you use the wrong pronoun intentionally." And then this Canadian woman said, "Well, there's no free speech in Canada." What do you think about that comment? And also this notion that you could be prosecuted if you don't use the right pronoun?
The prosecution part, honestly, is a little too far for me. I'm like,
Yeah.
that's a lot. That's a lot, especially if the like I don't know. It's hard because sometimes people are malicious about the way they go about things, but a lot of the time it's because they're ignorant and they don't know that this really hurts somebody and can really put a toll on their mental health. And I think having that information out on like the statistics of trans kids and suicide rates, like it's the highest out of any youth group ever. um,
Mhm.
so having information like that and statistics out, I think would help people just wrap their heads around how dangerous it can really be. So I don't think prosecution is the right answer. I think education is the right answer.
Mhm.
Um, Obviously, if it gets too far and they're like actually physically, verbally, mentally hurting you over time, then sure, prosecution, that's harassment at that point. But right away, I truly think that's a lot to put somebody through because they're uneducated.
Yeah, I agree with that. It also feels a bit scary if you are going to prosecute somebody who is maybe intentionally or not intentionally using the wrong pronouns, because I feel like people can take it the wrong way and take it out on the queer community, like if you meet somebody who might be an aggressive person and then you prosecute them for using a wrong word. I feel like this happens too sometimes when you call somebody out, it can do more harm than educating. I think educating is a great way to approach that. Prosecution just seems scary. It seems like you're placing a lot of people in dangerous situations.
Interesting. Well, I think it's really interesting. I didn't know what to expect in the answers you'd give. So, and it's something that just happened a few days ago. So I'm quite interested to know. And since I don't live in Canada, I was kind of interested in what your perspective is. So I have another interesting question, which is intriguing for me as a scientist, public health specialist, is if gender is fluid, why is it necessary to have medical transitions? And what are the pros and cons of these types of transitions? I just think if gender is fluid and if you can in society live in a gender fluid way, why do we have to take hormones or surgically remove parts of the bodies or add parts to the body if it's actually dangerous from a physical health perspective? I wondered if you had some notions or ideas about that.
Yeah. Winnie, I have just maybe a few things I can say, but if you
Go
want
ahead.
to.
Go ahead, Manisha.
You can start. Yeah, yeah, you can start.
So obviously, okay, once again, I'm not an expert. I don't identify as being trans. So I've never had to think about transitioning or about seeking like affirming care in the way of transitioning. I have been to therapy and have discussed like my gender. So that is a form of gender affirming care I have been through. But just like Winnie said, statistically, trans youth have the highest rates of suicide, suicidal ideation, psychological distress, and it can reach up to like 16 times greater than their like cis counterparts, which is incredibly high. But I guess for me, I approach it more from an academic side because like you, I'm in epidemiology, public health, so I am interested in the implications of public health measures in trans affirming care. So, like scientifically and statistically, gender affirming care has been associated to lower odds of like psychological distress and all of these negative mental health outcomes. So when you provide individuals with care that affirms their identity, it not only like makes them feel better within their mind, but once you start attacking what like outer, I guess, I don't know how to like, I don't know, a lot of queer youth, I guess, experience gender dysphoria, um, and body dysmorphia. So the way that your body looks doesn't align with how you feel in your mind. And I think that's really hard to overcome. And I think for me too, personally, like I have like a bigger chest. And sometimes that does affect the way I like perceive myself and the way that I feel about myself because I don't want people to look at me and just because I have like bigger boobs like it doesn't mean I want to be like sexualized as a woman or that I want to be perceived as a woman. So but for me thankfully I have found comfort in having like this body that I'm in and I now love this body that I'm in, but that doesn't happen for everybody, right? Some people can't get over the hurdle of looking at themselves and being like, like this might not be the body that I want.
But
And once you, pardon?
go ahead, Manisha. I just had something to say about that, but go ahead.
You can go. You can.
Well, I'm just thinking it's a bit like though this whole craze on plastic surgery, like people my age getting facelifts and nose jobs and boob jobs, and it's like also something that's being sold by society about what your body's supposed to look like and what a female's supposed to look like and what a male's supposed to look like and what a beautiful person's supposed to look like and what a, you know, so in some ways I feel like it's a bit of the medicalization and also the commercialization of what a body should look like.
Yeah, to a degree, I agree with you. I think that because of the norms that have been placed regarding what certain genders have to look like, that lends a lot to like the psychological like distress that queer and trans youth experience. I think ideally, if we could live in a world that didn't construct gender in the way that it did, people wouldn't have to transition, like, or medically transition, right? They wouldn't. But unfortunately, in this world, that's not the case, you know? Like having boobs, if you identify as a trans man or a trans non-binary individual, for some people is really hard. And it's really hard because like, well, I also don't know because I'm okay with my boobs. But I think it goes beyond to like what gender means for the outside world. I feel like it's more what gender means to that person, you know? And yeah, I don't know. Winnie, do you have any,
Yeah,
do you have
Winnie.
any thoughts?
Yeah, so I am non-binary. I also categorize myself in the trans community, even though I have never medically transitioned. I've never taken any hormones, and I have never had any confirming surgeries. But as a kid, I did think about it. I also have quite big chest, and honestly, I hate it. But I did my research on it, and it is a very big surgery to do on your body. And the surgery is one thing, recovering is another thing. That takes honestly like months to recover from top surgery. And I did my research. I talked to a therapist, I talked to doctors about it, and I realized that it was just more of what society was putting onto me of like, oh, if you're non-binary, you shouldn't have anything that makes you look like a man or a woman. And that's not true. That's not true. You can be non-binary and look however you want, whether that be top surgery, no top surgery, getting on hormones or not getting on hormones. I think that's the beauty of the fluidity of being non-binary and gender. But honestly, it was the pressure of society being like, well, if you feel more masculine, you got chop your tits off, basically, like that you don't have a choice. And I kind of that thought stuck into my head for over 3 years until I actually talked to somebody. Um, and people gave me other choices where we have things called binders where you can put on basically like a sports bra, but it compresses your chest, makes you have a flatter chest. You don't have to go through surgery. It can be a little uncomfortable to wear over hours, but it's a choice that you have where you don't have to do surgery. You can still have that kind of look of the chest that you want. So that was something that opened my mind up. But I think also a lot of people need that, again, education to be out there to know that there's other choices besides doing surgery and getting on hormones as soon as you have a certain thought in your mind. Also, I will add you cannot get any of these surgeries or get on hormones unless you've gone through puberty and you have your parents' permission, depending on your age and what you want to do. But yeah, I would say that these surgeries are life saving in some situations. And at the same time, we do need education on other options.
Yeah. I have just a little point when you were talking. Thanks for sharing all that. Um, I think too that a lot of people, maybe more so like individuals who are not like well versed in like trans healthcare or like queer culture, when they think about transitioning, they automatically go to the medical transition, right? Which in a lot of the case isn't actually what happens. Like when he said, like get these surgeries without like extensive care in general. Like you need to talk to your parents, you need to a lot of the times have a therapist, you need to talk to doctors, there's a lot of consultation that goes on, and some people go through that process and they decide that they want these surgeries or that they don't. So I think, like Winnie said again, like education is really important, because gender affirming care and transitioning doesn't just mean surgery. It means like therapy. It means, yeah, well, I guess it can mean a lot of things, but it's not just like the medicalization of transitioning. It's so much more.
And interesting, I think I've been really like I've really learned a lot from what you have to say about that. And thank you for sharing your story. That was very, very helpful for me and for the listeners. What I'm interested in is, you know, what is important ultimately, from what I'm understanding, is that having community where you understand who you are from a gender perspective and from a sexual orientation or sexuality perspective is really important. One of the things that I've also heard from a cisgendered older male was that there's too many gay people on TV and that it's not good for young people to see that. I was quite horrified when I heard that, but they said you're going to influence young people and it's going to confuse them. What do you think about that statement?
I mean, having straight people only on TV, I think, confused me a lot. So I think representation is so important. Like, it's what's confusing about seeing somebody live their truth, It's just you can see yourself in different parts of different people. Like, I don't know. Yeah, like I feel like if there were gay people on TV when I was younger, everything would have made sense a lot quicker, right? Like I wouldn't have had to go through a lot. I even think like my parents probably would have had like a much easier time with like my queer journey if there was representation, because it's opening up like different worlds that you might not be exposed to. So that's just a funny statement that people like to say.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I needed to hear that. What about you, Winnie?
Yeah, I also think that's hilarious. Like, I mean, straight people have been in the industry on TV, movies forever. Imagine if I was like, there's too many straight people like on TV. Like this is too much for me. I will never watch TV again. I think that's I don't know. I just think it's so funny. But um the only like really queer representation I saw on TV as a kid, my mom would watch a lot of Filipino channel on TV, and queer people in the Filipino community don't have the best rep. They're they're on TV, but they're portrayed more as the butt of the joke most of the time. And so that's the representation I saw when I was younger on TV. And I was like, well, I don't want to come out. I don't want to be laughed at or like made fun of because that's what I see on TV. So I'm going to be a straight woman. So if I had like more queer positive representation on TV, I think honestly, for my parents and myself, it would have been so much easier. So
Yeah.
much easier. Yeah.
Wow. Well, I really want to thank you. I think this has been, wow, an amazing conversation. And I think it's going to be really elucidating for a lot of people who are not familiar with the community, and also for those who are in their journey themselves. I really hope they'll listen. I really want to thank you so much. Is there anything that you want to say to kind of close off our conversation?
I would just like to say if there's anybody queer listening, that things will get better. I promise you. And therapy is great. Doctors, you just have to find the right one. I know it's freaking hard, but I have faith in you that things will be okay.
Oh, thank you. Manisha?
I'd like to echo what Winnie just said. And I think that, not to get all cheesy, but I think life is a beautiful journey, and you're going to go through shit times, but you're also going to have the best times of your life. And all that really matters, I think, at the end of the day, is that you find the people you love and who love you, and everything will be all right.
Yeah, thank you. Well, thank you, both of you. You're both beautiful people, and I've learned a lot. This has been a fabulous conversation for me personally, but also for everybody who's going to listen. So I look forward to hearing what listeners have to say, and have a great afternoon and evening, and I'll talk to you soon.
Yeah,
Thank
thank
you.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.